Whilst visiting the Black Watch Museum last year, we had this rare opportunity to share the unveiling of this exciting item that had been lost yet rediscovered in the archives of the Black Watch Museum. This clip comes from the full video of our visit, which you can find by following the link in the bio. Now please sit back and enjoy the story of this incredible item. So Donald, you're the man that's been able to reveal the story behind this cape. What was the purpose of this cape? Was it a sort of rain jacket? Was it a gas cape? What kind of cape is it?
Well, we didn't know. And our original idea was that it might be a gas cape because you see the pictures of the guys with that, over and the kind of ground sheet just made into something that will maybe protect them to some degree. But when you look at it more carefully, it has a lot of pockets. It's really quite a complex garment. Mm-hmm. And so it didn't seem to make much sense that it would be a gas cape. But nevertheless, there's all this damage as if somebody has been in the trenches and has been splattered with blood, not just once, but from all sides. And down here, actually a real concentration, as if he's tried to drag somebody around, or he's had somebody actually impressing himself on him. On the inside as well, there is no blood. So it doesn't seem as if he actually was shot. So we looked into the whole gas cape thing, and that seemed unlikely, and looked into where else he might have used this. Now, we knew that he had been in Mesopotamia later in the war, but it seemed highly unlikely he would take a thing like this to Mesopotamia. So that seemed out, although what we discovered about him in Mesopotamia was very interesting because he was a cipher officer and involved in quite secret stuff, I think, later on in the war. The other option was that maybe it was something he would have worn in the Second World War, because he was active in the Second World War as one of the pioneer corps, and he was operational there in Brittany at the time that the Germans were pushing the British forces out of Brittany. So he would have been involved in heavy stuff there, and maybe we thought then. And then finally, of course, the most obvious thing would be that it was First World War in the trenches where he was, and we know that he was there in 1916 at the beginning of the Somme. What finally made us sure about what it was actually a label. And we'll maybe be able to look at the label later on. There's a label in there from the manufacturers of this cape, and the label's dated, well, it doesn't have a date on it, but we tried to date it and looked through the company, the records of the company that made the cape, and found that they operated in a certain area of Edinburgh in 1906, and then they moved to a different place after that. The address that's on this label is the 1906 address. So we took it from that this cape was made round about 1906 or thereabouts, and that meant that the cape was probably a First World War cape and something that he had taken to Flanders. And as an officer, he would have bought this himself and worn it, and the pockets and all that inside, that would make sense that if he was doing that. So it seems that he went to Flanders with this cape. He wasn't actually involved in trench warfare a great deal. He had various issues that led him not to be doing that. But by the time he did get into the trenches, this disaster happened that led to all the blood and led to him actually being invalided out with shell shock, actually. His story as far as the war altogether is concerned is that I believe this is quite a common thing, that as a family, somebody coming from a family of officers and a kind of county family and so on, he would have expected to go into the World War I as an officer. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there was space for all the officers who were willing to go. So a number of them went in initially as privates, and that's certainly what he did, to the Cameron Highlanders, and he was there for a year. But having been with them for a year, he got his commission with the Black Watch, but he got sent out to Flanders, and ironically, got stopped from carrying on to the trenches because he had an illness and he was hospitalised for 2 weeks, and the illness was German measles. So he couldn't fight the Germans because he had German measles. He then went into the trenches, but only for 2 sessions of a week before he was ill again. And in that second illness was a flu. And this was interesting too, because Spanish flu at that time was not recognized as such. The Americans gave it, well, not the name, but the Americans recognized it in 1917 or so on. But this was 1916. But there are papers now being written where doctors are looking back and they're saying the flus that were going around in the spring of 1916 probably were Spanish flu. He was hospitalized for 3 months. So it seems as though he had Spanish flu before anybody really knew that Spanish flu existed. So when he came back at the beginning of the Somme to rejoin his regiment and to rejoin his company, D Company, he had very little experience really of trench warfare, and he ended up being involved in this attack, but his company, whereas others succeeded fairly quickly, had a lot of trouble, and they were attacking up a trench when a strong point started shelling them, and they got trapped there. So the company was reduced at that point from whatever it would be, 200 men or something, to 33, and only one officer left, and that one officer was him. So we think all of this would have happened at that point, and that he would have been there and shells would have been landing for hour upon hour, causing the splashes of blood, and then maybe he was trying to drag people out or whatever. At the end of that, the Seaforths were sent up to reinforce them, but I think all that did was crowd the trench more and made it more deadly for everybody. It wasn't until a Stokes gun got brought up in the evening that they were able to get rid of this strong point and then get people out. He was almost immediately invalided out, and we have the note from the medical officer to say that he was being invalided out with shell shock. And again, this seems really interesting. Again, he was early with Spanish flu, but he was very early with shell shock, because the Lancet had mentioned shell shock in 1915. This is 1916, and somebody's writing on a little note shell shock and sending him off. Craig Lockhart wasn't in place. Nobody was really aware, I don't think, to a great degree of shell shock at this point. So, first with Spanish flu and the first with shell shock.
Can I just ask a wee quick question here? How did the museum actually come by obtaining this? Do we know how?
Well, it's come in a number of different batches from his family. He didn't have any children himself, but he had a very close relationship business-wise with somebody. And then in the next generation, sorry, that was wrong. He did. He had a son. And it was his son and this business associate who started donating stuff to the museum. But the son ended up in a care home, and the friend kept going through the material. They had works somewhere, and they had a lot of the material just stored in this place, so it was loads and loads of material sitting there. And this man has gone through it, and gradually, as he's gone through it, donated the bits and pieces to us. But this had been sitting in the store here before either Ginat or myself were here, and she found it in there, you know, and was astonished.
And you're the man that's able to share its story.
To try and find out what was going on. And there's still so many interesting things about it to be pursued. You know, it's I stopped about a year ago and started doing other things, but seeing all the material round about here again, thinking about it, I'd quite like to get back into it again and answer some of the questions that
It's just one of those questions. What happened? How's this happened? Has it been the result of a shrapnel hitting men and splatters coming from the men with all this here?
Yeah.
Or like you've mentioned with the big concentrations here,
That's right.
has it been someone that you've been trying to assist?
Yes.
Or it's just one of these things we'll might never unfortunately know?
And in a lot of ways it's quite good not to know, because all the options are all possibilities, and the men that were wearing these things and this was happening to went through all of them. And also that it takes in the possibility of the other parts of the war that he was involved in, and whether there was a possibility of that.
Also, this just shows you how chaotic the First World War
yes,
was like in the trenches. And
yeah.
he says this is a guy that didn't have really much experience in the trenches. So for this to be one of his first main experiences, for him to end up in this condition, it's no real surprise that he ended up with shell shock.
With the shell shock. And I believe that the shell shock can be all that, the explosions and all the rest of it, but also what you have to do yourself. And if he was having to deal with that situation, and he was the only officer left, and all the responsibility of that, no doubt there was an element of that as well that it affected him.
So, Donald, can you point out where D Company was at the time?
Well, altogether, the attack was on this village here. And D Company were on the right wing of this attack. So they were pushing up, I think, I can't say for definite, but I think they were pushing up in this kind of direction, like this. And then they found this trench. And they started working their way, and bombing their way is the expression that was used in the diaries, up this trench, until at some point they got stuck because this building here, this farm, had been turned into a strong point by the Germans, and they were shelling from here, and they were the Montgomery and his men were then trapped. The other officers, one disappeared, another couple were injured, one died on the scene, and he knew about that, and so by the stage of them being stuck there, he was left as the man in command.
So these are items here relating to Montgomery?
Yes, all of them are, and some of them we're still slightly researching and trying to work out about, for example, this book as to when exactly the material here was produced and who by and how they were related to Montgomery. But 3 of them, I think, stand out as being related to his story in terms of the Cape. And this one in particular is the note that the medical officer sent at the time that Montgomery was first diagnosed with shell shock. And I think to have a note dated 1916 in which a medical officer is saying that, the 14th of July 1916, is really quite an unusual thing to have. And again, something that would be worthy of further research. This photograph here comes from his time in the Second World War in Brittany. And he's pictured here with a number of other officers in what looks like a restaurant or hotel, with one man in the front dominating the photograph. If you turn it over, it's labelled General de Gaulle. We know that de Gaulle was in Brittany at the same time as Montgomery, and we know that de Gaulle had to escape to Britain. People won't believe me that this might be de Gaulle because they say he's in a British uniform and so on, but it seems to me possible. We don't know what went on at that time. It was a few days when everything was being kept secret. So why would it not be? And if it's not de Gaulle, why does it have his name on it? We've got a larger version of that picture, so it was obviously very important to Montgomery.